Chapter 9. False Prophets. The religious texts were all written by men, therefore the teachings are sexist, is how the feminists, those women who burn their bras, drop their pants, and make sluthood fashionable. Logic goes, or is more correct, the lack of their logic goes. There are male followers and proponents of this lack of logic, who in many cases are also opportunists, who have capitalized on the influence of this thinking upon society. Those men purport to be the new, enlightened, and sensitive men who are capable of reinterpreting the scriptures, be it the Torah, Bible, Teo, or whatever other scriptures are appropriate to their interests. They lecture, write articles, even books about the tolerant nature of God, not the redemptive or forgiving nature, for those two qualities imply wrongdoing or sinful actions, whereas the tolerant nature of God implies that everything is all right. Their roadshow plays to a large audience of women who appear to be quite willing to fill the coffers of those false prophets. There was a time when people would go to their clergymen to discuss actions that they had taken that they knew were wrong, and ask for advice, guidance, and prayers of forgiveness. The new gurus have decided that this is no longer necessary, because there is no sin. In Billy Graham's recent New York crusade in Central Park, he lamented that the line dividing sinful living and the good living have become blurred. He could just as well have said that it has been eradicated. The proponents of this new philosophy have a growing following amongst women, for it absolves them of all responsibility and obligations to authority and any feelings of guilt. Loyalty to the family, tribe, and race is not included in their teachings. They have brought the philosophy of narcissism into religion, or have subserved religion teachings in order to justify narcissism. These false prophets take on the air of sensitive, understanding, loving men, who have not only sympathy for women, but even empathy for them. They may take on the air of ascetic, even dress as one and eat as one. However, their ascetism does not extend to sex, which they will engage in with their devotees, even married ones. But not to worry, there is no evil in the eyes of the Lord as he watches us go about doing our own thing. Men know these false prophets as wimps and weak-kneed milksops who suck up the production of society for their survival. They in no way have the characteristics to bring about positive change, for that is a manifestation of masculine gender, something that is lacking in their makeup. Religion was established through the efforts of strong, virile men who had the courage and pioneering spirit to espouse the spiritual teachings that were entrusted to them. Men such as Abraham, Moses, John the Baptist, Peter, Paul, Muhammad, Martin Luther, John Wesley, and others worked hard, give an almost superhuman effort to their activities, faced danger continuously, faced execution for their beliefs. Humankind benefited from their productive efforts. Wimps didn't produce, they leached. Concerning the consequences of the way they live, this is what a few famous men had to say. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he reap. Jesus, 30 A.D. Whatsoever man soweth, that shall he also reap. Bidpai, 300 B.C. Whatsoever man soweth, that shall he reap. Buddha, 600 B.C. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he reap. Amenhotep IV, 1350 B.C. They all said it. The mystical law of cause and effect, which in today's jargon means what goes around comes around. This law of cause and effect provides the punishment referred to in the mystical texts. We are punished as a result of our sins, not because of them. There is no escape from the law, no beating the system, except for true repentance. To help us avoid having to learn everything the hard way, guides for living were prepared by the enlightened masters in various parts of the world. These guides for living are called Holy Scriptures and indicate the punishment in store for us if we do not live our lives according to the guidance offered. Do we not use this very same approach in the raising of our children? When at a pool club, I observed a mother with a container of hot coffee and her young daughter at the wading pool. The mother had placed the container at the edge of the pool, and when she saw her daughter reach for it, she said, "Don't drink it, it's hot." Still the child went after it, and the mother said, "Don't drink it, it's hot." The little girl picked it up, took a sip, and started to cry. The mother said, "I told you it was hot." Scripture tells us what is best for us and what isn't. If, like the little girl, we choose not to heed the advice that was given to us, we pay the consequences. In the mystical concept of existence, there is no such thing as good or bad, rather more evolved and less evolved, higher and lower, advanced, less advanced, and more advanced. We are all evolving in our own way and at our own pace. Ultimately, we shall all be saved and forgiven. However, until such time as we get there, we need the guidance and warning of the Scripture. Also, until we get there, we need to survive here, and we need this guidance to coexist with our fellow man. The event that motivated me to write this chapter was an interview with Stephen Mitchell, author of The Gospel According to Jesus, the neo-interpreter of the Tao and Bible, which appeared in the November 1991 issue of Yoga Journal. One would think that a more appropriate title would have been The Gospel According to Stephen Mitchell, but I guess that was too humble of an approach for this new age guru. A few of the assertions by Mitchell during this interview were, Jesus is not divine. He was illegitimate, made mistakes, had self-doubt. Paul was probably a Jew, but had his emotional problems. The mystical admonition to not give pearls to swine or bread to the dogs was intended for the Gentiles. The Tao was sexist. That is to say a lot, according that there wasn't any logic to support any of these assertions. But then logic doesn't exist in the non-masculine world. Men wrote all the books, therefore they are sexist. How does one argue against that? Just as my wife used to say that people listened to me more than they did to her because I had the penis. Maybe, but I wasn't going to make any changes to alter that situation to accommodate her. The Scriptures should not be altered either to accommodate the narcissistic philosophy of this day. Men wrote the Scriptures because that's what men do. They also know how to deal with wolves in sheep's clothing and wimps who prey upon women. Chapter 10. The Gender of Economics. Economics has to do with the production, consumption, and exchange of goods and services. The basic economic systems are capitalism and socialism. They are both Western theories. Capitalism calls upon the forces of the free market to determine the production, price, and distribution of goods and services. It is predicated upon giving each person the opportunity to invest their time and money as they choose, and to reap the consequences of this action. In its purest sense, it is fair and just. Capitalism is the masculine gender of economics. Socialism calls upon government to decide upon the production, price, and distribution of goods and services. It is predicated upon the economic sharing with all people according to their needs. In its pure sense, it is caring and nurturing. Socialism is the feminine gender of economics. No one entity or system can long survive with a major imbalance of genders, and this includes capitalism and socialism. Capitalism is cold, unfeeling, uncaring. A person gets what he or she earns. If they don't earn, they don't get. It makes for motivation, but not compassion. It is predicated upon the survival of the fittest, but makes no allowance for the unfit. Without the influence of the feminine gender, capitalism will deteriorate into barbarity. Since the basis of capitalism is freedom of action, the influence of the feminine gender is also on a free basis, and it manifests itself as charity. Capitalism cannot survive without charity. Volunteers provide almost all of the caring and nurturing equipment of capitalist society. From the smallest town to the largest town, volunteerism is in action on a continuing basis. There is not a human being in capitalist society that is not directly touched by the free giving of goods and services by individuals and groups for the benefit of others. Socialism is a non-motivating, uncreative, and inefficient. It is predicated upon the survival of all, but makes no allowance for the unique wants, desires, and contributions of the individual. Without the influence of the strong masculine gender, socialism will result in chaos. Since the basis of socialism in government control, and the government is masculine in gender, the viability of socialism depends upon the strength of government, which is the military. Those nations that have socialism without a strong military are nations in a state of chaos with a limited future. An exception to the need for a strong military rule would be where the male segment of the populace was already conditioned to be extremely docile. The nature of government, any government, is masculine in gender. Capitalism has no affinity for government, but instead has an affinity for the lack of government, which is feminine in nature. This is the reason that there is a resistance towards government investment by capitalists. Still, government is required in order for any societal grouping to long survive. To the consternation of the conservative capitalists, the tendency of this government in the domestic sphere will tend to be feminine gender influenced. A more detailed discussion of government will be made in the chapter under that heading. Suffice it now to realize that gender exists in economics and government, and these institutions are always under the influence of both genders. Chapter 11. The Gender of Government. The gender of government, any government, is masculine. The purpose of government is to govern. Even in our democracy, we speak for the consent of the governed. Being governed, or having a government, is a social mean to avoid chaos. That function of governing is a masculine gender function, a function for which the male is well equipped, mentally, physically, and temperamentally, which is why the male of any species rule or govern. One has only to observe the animal kingdom to understand what happens when the males are removed from any grouping. The females are left leaderless, and consequently go about in all directions aimlessly, until such time as a new male is able to take over the direction of the flock or herd. If the females are from a herbivorous species, they eventually become the dinner of the carnivore species. The administration of a grouping is government, and that is masculine gender function. It does not exist without the masculine gender. Within the framework of government, both feminine and masculine influences exist, and as has been repeated and will continually be repeated throughout this book, if a significant imbalance in this gender influence occurs, there will be deleterious effects on that government. There can never be complete agreement on the part of the sexes as what constitutes a balance. For as one prospective female employee said to me, "As I told my boyfriend, you men can never completely satisfy us, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't keep trying." She didn't get the job. The true test of relative gender balance is the accomplishment, stability, and evolvement of the race. For some 30 years, as Chamber of Commerce lectures, political meetings, in magazines, on TV, and in an assortment of women's publications, we heard of the wonders of the Soviet system and how there was no sex discrimination anywhere, how women were in all industries, at all management levels, involved in the entire economic process. Oh, shame on us in America that we were not doing the same. Now the world is witnessing what has happened to that non-sexist society. There has been little accomplishment. Instability is rampant, and about the only involvement they can point to is that they understand that the economic system based on the negative aspects of the feminine gender has collapsed. But not to worry, the natural response to the feminine in times of difficulty is to turn to the man and say, "Do something." So now these proponents of all that failed are turning to the male chauvinist pigs of America, Japan, and Germany, those nations that still have relative more of a masculine gender economy, and are saying, "Do something." This is what all organizations that have lost their masculine gender leadership do. They turn to the most masculine gender available and ask for help. That is what the Kaiser Corp did. That is what the farmers do when they want subsidies. That is what the self-help groups do. That's a real oxymoron, isn't it? That is what special interest groups do, especially the feminists, those women who burn their bras, drop their pants, and make sluthood fashionable, who would be nothing without the legislation of government, that bastion of the manifestation of the masculine gender. The same dissolution of the economy and the government that is happening in Eastern Europe happens to all groupings or organizations that lose their masculine gender influence. Families are deteriorating, crime has increased, Social interest groups have proliferated, and society has become at odds with itself. What is happening to us is no different than what has happened to the flock of chickens when the rooster is removed. There is chaos and disarray. The manifestation of the masculine gender has decreased, and the government has become more difficult. We will know that our government has reached a better balance of gender when there is less crime, when we have fewer people in prison, when children born out of wedlock are a rarity, when SAT scores improve, when diverse groups are no longer divergent, when the feminist, those women who burn their bras, drop their pants, and make sluthood fashionable, movement is but a bad memory. Chapter 12. Tyranny at Home. The period from the beginning of World War I to the beginning of World War II was a time of extreme devotion to family, home, tradition, country, and faith. And the first half of this century was a time during which there was a strong manifestation of the masculine gender. These two factors, when combined, caused an influence in society that resulted in order, loyalty, obedience, and devotion to the family, tribe, and race. It also ushered in an era of totalitarianism. Much has been said and written about this period in our history, but most of it in regard to the international scene. This period also saw a significant influence in the home, the result of which there was a negative effect on several subsequent generations. An extreme of loyalty to a particular cause or group frequently results in prejudice towards those who do not believe in that particular cause, or who are not from that particular group. This condition exists not only on the international scene, but on the domestic scene as well. Good Catholic girls did not go out with non-Catholic boys. Jewish boys would marry good Jewish girls. Chinese girls were forbidden to go out with non-Chinese boys. Good Greek girls would only marry Greek boys. Black girls didn't go out with white boys. And so it went. Racial, religious, and ethnic purity was high objectives in the loyalty to the family, tribe, and race. It also made for a restricted social life for young people, especially girls, at least for the good girls. The ultimate sanctity of any society grouping is the purity and virtue of the females. The ultimate disrespect of a grouping is the defilement of their women, and the ultimate defilement is rape. In any war, the conquering army can be counted upon to rape the women of the conquered. This occurs not only because of the pent-up sexual energy of the soldiers, but because of a desire to impress upon the defeated that they have been truly conquered. And what better way to make this impression than to have sex with their women? The philosophy of having high standards for a society group results in motivating that society to a high moral level, and it is only natural for the males to imbue their women with these standards, for these women will become the mothers of their children and the icons of the home. Not everyone could adhere to these standards, but as long as the standards were set at the average moral development of the race, most people could meet them. For those who could not meet these standards, be they men or women, there were always a man for every woman, and a woman for every man, regardless of their moral standard. This system allowed for a natural selection of mates while still having a moral standard, and worked very well, but when ethnic, racial, and religious purity became a goal in a diverse society, problems arose. In a society of diverse groupings with a non-integrated social philosophy, all the women in a particular grouping suddenly became pure, virtuous, and holy. This then meant that the males of any grouping, if they were to satisfy their carnal desires, would be doing so with females of another grouping, those who were not so pure. And while male promiscuity was more restricted than is generally imagined, it is more condoned than female promiscuity. However, it was only condoned if it were with women not of their kind. Therefore, the promiscuous male of any grouping were having sex with females outside of their grouping. It sort of became a reenactment of the conquer and conquered. The women of the other group could be defiled, but not by one's own group. Mathematics does not support the implication of that philosophy, and we can reasonably conclude that there had been a lot of acting and many guilty confessions on the wedding night. More importantly, the young married men were going to bed with those who were pure and saintly, and depending upon the degree of matriarchal influence in their grouping, which, as we shall see, was much higher than we generally acknowledge, they were also going to bed with their mothers. This did not make for a natural communal relationship, nor did it enable those males to exhibit the healthy, strong, virile manifestation of the masculine gender necessary for the continued progress of the evolvement of the race. The focal point of society's devotion to the family, tribe, and race was the home. If there was any institution that was reverted in the early parts of the century, it was the home. Mom, apple pie, and the home were symbolic of our racial, ethnic, and religious devotion. Even criminals revere the home, for the home was sacred ground. Why didn't we think of Dad and apple pie, or Mom and Dad and apple pie, or Mom and Dad and ham and eggs? The obvious reason is that Dad wasn't there very much. The 40-hour work week had not yet occurred. Dad usually worked 6 days a week and was often gone from the house 12 to 14 hours a day. This left Dad time to do little more than eat and sleep at home. And while society at that time was essentially masculine gender-oriented, the men were kings. Their kingship was not in the castle. The castle was ruled by the queen. And rule she did. Since Dad was away, it was Mom who was responsible for the total raising of the children. Mom saw to it that the children went to bed on time, got up on time, dressed appropriately, did their homework, had proper manners, respected everybody, had the right moral standards, worshipped regularly, and were always obedient. Some mothers could handle this load with love and understanding. Some became tyrants. They became tyrants not because they were bad women, but because they were ordinary women put in an unnatural situation. The unnatural situation being the relative absence of the positive attributes of the masculine gender. These tyrant mothers had a profoundly adverse effect on their children, which would affect their interpersonal relationships and their ability to project the positive manifestation of their respective genders. There were enough of these tyrant mothers that the combined adverse effect upon their children would create a severe negative effect on society. As these children became adults, it would affect interpersonal relationships, the concept of loyalty, and the positive manifestation of both the masculine and feminine gender. The tyrant mother had an honorable goal, to raise good children. To accomplish this objective, she worked tirelessly and maintained constant vigilance on the activities of her offspring. She was revered and respected by her husband, the schools, the clergy, the law, the medical profession, and any and all institutions that she came in contact with, for she was a woman who was devoting her life to raise good children. Good children performed well in school, and even if they weren't particularly bright, they still listened to their teacher and got an A in conduct. Good children dressed properly, wore neat and clean, orderly, always finished their dinner, did their homework, were properly social, courteous, considerate of others, selfless, and respected all authority, especially the highest authority, Mother. Mother operated from a powerful base, the kitchen. It was in the kitchen that Mom ruled with absolute authority. The kitchen furniture, decorations, china, and utensils were all purchased by Mom, as was the food. Mom stored things where she wanted, arranged the furniture the way she wanted, arranged dinner time to be when she wanted, cooked what she wanted, in the manner that she wanted, except for poor families in small apartments who might have used the kitchen as the family room and living room. Even Father was not permitted in the kitchen other than at mealtimes. From this base of absolute power, Mom's authority extended throughout the home. Her authority extended beyond the material aspect of the home, and engulfed the lives of all who lived in it. There was no room or activity that was not under the omnipresent eye of Mom. Mom checked on the homework, on the baths were taken, that the radio wasn't played too loudly, that the bedtime was adhered to. Mom supervised the social life of the children in minute details. She decided who the good boys and good girls were, and who could be played with and who couldn't. She determined if the children were acting socially proper and if they were popular with their peers. Father's home life and social life were also under the direction and control of the tyrant mother. He lived in the home that his wife made for him and had a social life that his wife created for him. It should come to no surprise that this era of the tyrant mother, 1914 through 45, was also the era of worldwide gains in women's suffrage. The women's suffrage movement succeeded by default during a time that men were little more than beasts of burden, a visitor in their own home. Women did not get equality with men. They filled in the vacuum left by men. All of the aforementioned activities and objectives of the tyrant mother were activities and objectives that had been considered to be laudatory since the beginning of time. The reason that mother became the tyrant during this era is because of the imbalance of gender that had manifested in the home. The extreme negative manifestation of masculine gender is brutality, and the extreme negative manifestation of feminine gender is extremism and cruelty. The tyrant mother, not answering to anyone, was extreme and cruel. It was one thing to raise orderly children with high moral and ethic values. It was quite another thing to see orderliness progress to obedience, then compliance, then subservience. If there was any one characteristic that typified the child of the tyrant mother, it was subservience. Subservience to the teacher, priest, rabbi, minister, neighbor, company, employer, public servant, doctor, any adult, especially the mother. All that her child did and accomplished was a result of the effort and the devotion of the tyrant mother. If the child was in the 2nd grade and got straight A's on her report card, it was because mother saw to it that she studied. If she excelled in dance, it was because her mother took her to dance school and made her practice at home. If he was courteous, it was because of the training mother gave him. Whatever the accomplishment, it was because of mother. Whatever the failure, it was because mother was not obeyed. However, it was rare that the tyrant mother was not obeyed, for she had in her arsenal what seemed like an infinite supply of punishments. There were the basics such as severe scolding, grounding, spankings, and doing extra chores. Even the basic spanking given by the tyrant mother could be a very memorable event, depending on the weapon she chose to use. There was the old-fashioned switch, the hairbrush, the cooking spoon, broom, shoe, or whatever was handy at the time. One 50-year-old woman told me that she would remember a beating she received with a hairbrush all her life, and while she couldn't remember what the beating was for, she did remember that she realized she must never get mother angry. For the more sadistic tyrant mothers, there was making the child kneel on rice, locking them in closets, locking them out of the house, and sending them to bed without dinner. There was always public ridicule and condemnation, which was especially effective with female offspring. To pine in front of the neighbors, relations, or even total strangers about the ungrateful, disobedient daughter that she had. This was the "what a martyr I am" approach. Oh, there was the yelling and screaming in public about the shortcomings of the girls. This was the "I will completely humiliate you" approach. Occasionally, there would be some adolescent daughter who would rebel, who would give evidence to having a self, of being a person who wanted to express her desires and feelings. For these hardcore cases, the tyrant mother would enlist the aid of the clergy, who themselves were in a control position in society, and whose major supporters were the tyrant mothers, and whom they in turn would support in their efforts to cope with an unruly child. Also, there was the support of the 4th commandment, which read, "Thou shalt honor thy father and thy mother, 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 all the days of thy life." So it was off to the rabbi, priest, or minister with the unruly daughter, and together mother and clergy would do the Mexican hat dance around her psyche until any semblance of self and womanhood were stamped out, and she returned home the subservient creature that she was raised to be. Nor was there to be any help from father, who, while a king outside of the castle, was a complete serf when inside the castle. His advice, when his children would complain about the overbearing mother, would be, "You know you should listen to your mother, she means well." Or, for the more timid and realistic, "You know you shouldn't get your mother angry." It is no surprise that these children would grow up with a resentment towards authority, and for any woman, a deep subconscious resentment towards male authority figures, not for what their fathers did, but for what they didn't do. For when they were in trouble and needed help, their fathers did not help them, but instead supported the tyranny that they were living under. For boys, there was the public slapping around, which usually was employed by mother who did not have a man at home. For those who had husbands who were completely removed from the discipline of their children, these mothers would beat their sons on the subway, bus, and street corner, or would come to the office in the morning and tell everybody how they chased their son around the house, beating him from room to room. Those mothers who did not have a man at home who would administer punishment had the equivalent of a big, obedient gorilla who they could unleash on their children. An Italian-American friend of mine, who was one of 9 children, told me that when his father came home from work, his mother would have all the children sitting in a circle around the living room, and then she would point to a bad one, whom the father would then slam, then to another bad one, who in turn would get it slammed, or to a so-so one, who would get a stiff kick in the rear, and remind him or her what would happen if they progressed to bad. So while many fathers might have administered discipline, they were in reality only the hitmen, or enforcers of the punishment meted by the tyrant mother. It was only occasionally that the father might ask the question. If he asked me, "Dad, why are you beating me up?" what do I say? If the tyrant mother said to a child was bad, he was bad, and there was nothing to question. It could be said that the tyrant mother might have been overzealous, but she did motivate her children to achieve and succeed. This is a misconception, for her desire to have a child perform well was only while they were very young. A mother would take the credit for a second grader who got all A's, or danced well, or played an instrument well, or behaved well. But if those same children at the age of 17 got all A's, danced well, played an instrument well, or got a good job, most people would realize that it was a function of the ability of the child, and not much the result of the influence of the mother. Therefore, the tyrant mother began to underplay accomplishments and achievements of her children as her children got older, and instead put the emphasis on social behavior, or on intangibles, which were difficult to quantify. Perhaps her daughter got excellent grades in high school, so she was told that she didn't dress well, or didn't get involved in enough parties, or the right parties, or her hair never looked right. It was always compared to her peer group, and always came up lacking in the comparison. The common phrase of the tyrant mother was, "You'll never amount to anything," or a sometimes substitute for addressing their daughters, "You'll never get married," which really means the same as "You'll never amount to anything." This phrase was uttered by black and white mothers, Christian and Jewish mothers, Nordic and Latin mothers. Where it originated and what caused it to spread, I do not know. I do know that the phrase, "You'll never amount to anything," rang in the ears of all who were raised by tyrant mothers, and the effect on those generations was that they indeed contribute very little to society in the relative sense. This same attitude and manifestation towards the boys as well. But the boys did get some respite, for boys had more opportunities to be out. They had part-time jobs, were in school athletic teams, or were involved in sandlot sports of various types. Most mothers wanted boys out of the house, to be with their own kind. The girls were not so fortunate. As their daughters reached their teens, the tyrant mother activities were forced on getting their daughters married. This met with the approval of the fathers and society in general, for in getting the daughter married off, they in effect were soaking up the supply of single men and getting them into responsible, productive situations, a necessity for the progress of society. There were organizations at that time that provided faculties for teenagers that would enable the natural meeting and interrelating with the opposite sex. Various religious, ethnic, and secular groups sponsored these organizations. Representative of the groups were the Catholic Youth Organization, which would have dances in various churches on Friday nights, the Greek Orthodox Youth of America, which would have formal religious dances, the YMCA and the YWHA, and the many Jewish centers which would arrange various social events. These events were all chaperoned and provided a secure atmosphere for girls to begin to relate with boys, to size them up in preparation for the selection of a mate. Most boys were just beginning to discover girls, and weren't as yet so sure why they related with them, but it was enjoyable, and they might even try it again. Most women who had the experience of attending these communal activities when they were girls look back upon them with fond memories. There were also unpleasant memories of these activities, which consisted of the reporting to the headquarters after the dance, giving an account to the tyrant mother of how popular she was, how many times she was asked to dance, and what prospects she unearthed for a steady boyfriend, which was the prelude to an engagement and then marriage. It was even worse if the tyrant mother attended the dance, for then the daughter would receive a first-hand detailed accounting of how poorly she performed in relation to her peer group. The belief that these mothers were preparing their daughters for marriage was another misconception. Their daughters were raised to be subservient to their mothers, and this subservience was expected to last the lifetime of their mothers. Getting their daughters married showed the competence of the tyrant mother, and that she raised a marriageable daughter, and the marriage itself provided a vehicle that would rid her of the economic responsibilities of her daughter. Having attained the objective of getting her daughter married and being free of any financial responsibilities toward her, the tyrant mother could now devote the entire relationship with her daughter as the infallible critic of her flawed performances. While there was tremendous effort expended by the tyrant mother to get her daughter married, there was hardly any effort expended on preparing for her marriage, except perhaps in the most negative sense. Advice such as, "Don't love him too much," "Don't tell him everything," "Don't expect too much from sex," "How could she? She didn't even know what it was the norm. Regarding her preparation for the prospect of pregnancy, she had been told an assortment of quasi-truths and outright fabrications, which would give her little if any insight into the reality of the situation. "If a man touches you below the waist, you'll get pregnant," was one. Having received this sage advice from her mother, a woman told me that when she was 14 at an amusement park with her girlfriends, a man fondled her below the waist. She told all of her friends that she was pregnant, even after she eventually had a menstrual period, for the tyrant mother never told her that there was any connection between the menstrual period and pregnancy. "You'll know you're pregnant when you don't have a period anymore," which, while a step beyond the previous advice, left out some pertinent information. "If you're in a room with a man and he unzips his fly, you'll get pregnant," was at least a possibility. These quotes by themselves could be very humorous, however, when we consider that they pertain to the most important physical and emotional event of a woman's life, and that she didn't even know what caused it is tragic. Under the tutelage of the tyrant mother, it was not at all unusual for young college women to not know what caused pregnancy. No, the tyrant mother did not prepare her daughters for marriage or any other situation involving interpersonal relationships. The grip of the tyrant mother over her sons was equally strong, and she would do her best to keep them from getting married, for the Oedipus complex was very much alive, and she would manipulate and connive to keep some women from getting her son. The Catholic tyrant mother, who would have gone into hysterics if her daughter had joined a convent, would have gone into ecstasy if her son had become a priest, for then she knew no other woman could have him. Usually there were only two women that the tyrant mother would have no object to, the one her son had just broken off with, and the one he had not yet started to date. If she could not keep her son from getting married, she was sure to maintain her influence over him after he did. So, ingrained was a loyalty to the family, tribe, and race, that the issue of the dominant mother was rarely discussed outside of one's tribal grouping, or more often than not even outside of one family structure. On the occasion when it was discussed publicly, it was done half-heartedly or jovially, for good boys and girls did not talk negatively about their parents, especially when they became adults. This reticence to discuss the problem caused by one's suppressed childhood was also due to being objectively unaware of the issue. When Philip Roth's book, Portney's Complaint, which contained specific abuse of the dominant mother, was published, it apparently surprised society that this condition existed, even though it was only Jewish people that were affected, or so society, and for that matter, the Jewish people thought. Jewish mothers were interviewed on television, for magazines and radio, as were experts on the Jewish culture. However, all these media people, with their skilled interviewing ability, never unearthed the fact that this same condition existed in other cultures. If Philip Roth had been black mothers would have been interviewed. If he had been Italian mothers would have been interviewed. The culture of the tyrant mother infiltrated households of all religions, ethnic and racial groupings, the tragedy being that the nation did not know it, but its effects would be manifested in every facet of our lives until the end of the century, and perhaps beyond.